deprived for the past few days. So I might be a bit more low energy today. But hi everyone. Welcome again. I don't know how many of you attended last week's session, but this is quite intimately connected to what we were talking about last week. So we're gonna let before we get into it, we're gonna start with a brainstorming exercise as usual, but just recap what we were let me recap a bit of what we were talking about last week, just so everyone's up to speed. We started with the Enlightenment and sort of its notions of reason, right? We talked about Isaac Newton and his mathematical model of the universe, about Descartes, and sort of this idea of like, oh, you want to grasp these eternal, indisputable truths. And then we sort of unpacked that through Edward Said, right? We kind of showed that, like, well, it's not that simple. Truth, knowledge isn't neutral. Even when you say they're objective or universal or dispassionate, you still kind of have to think about the person who is making these claims and how this kind of knowledge is constructed. So that's sort of the basic gist of what we were talking about last week. This week, we're going to turn to the notion of the subject, and especially this notion of desire. And so, again, we unpacked reason last week. This week, we're unpacking desire. That's sort of the key word for today. And so, before we start, as usual, I have a brainstorming session. I have my sheet ready. Um, what do you guys think? When you think of the word desire, what comes to your mind? What how might you experience it? Again, just type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you, however you want to do it. So desire, what do you think when you think about desire? One of the Yeah, okay, that's a very that's a very religious reading. I guess I can write that down. Desire is sinful. Christianity. Okay, okay. Okay, you want something strongly. Okay. Okay. Do you think all humans have desire or experience it in the same way? Is there maybe a motivating example could be someone, a finance bro in FIDI in New York and anggota suku Baduy. Do you think they experience okay? Do you wanna elaborate on that, Brenda? How do you think how do you think desire might vary from person to person?
I'm pretty. I don't really know how to elaborate it
That's
other
okay.
than like humans have like different motivations.
Hmm. Hmm.
So d- different motivations, different reasoning, and thus I come to the conclusion that also everyone has the feeling of this. They experience the feeling of desire differently too.
Okay. 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 Good. Okay. And then Dimas. Okay, it's almost deeper. Okay, it's on a deeper level. Almost, hmm, almost like almost identity or existential level. I guess we could say that. Is desire in it? Hmm. Right. Do you want to elaborate on that? Are you suggesting that you can be a human being without desiring whatever you
I
mean
was
by desiring?
thinking like desire and wanting is two different things, right?
Okay,
Wanting
elaborate.
something versus desiring something. Desire, when I think about desire, there's an element of almost like like coveting something. Like kamu tuh pengen banget gitu. Kayak pengen banget
Hmm.
banget. It's not like you just want it. You,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, okay, okay. Desire is almost okay. So similar to I don't know who said it earlier that you want something very strongly. It's almost on a deeper, more fundamental level, maybe I would say that. Okay, good. There are no right answers, as we'll see soon. We're gonna start, or at least Spivak is gonna start unpacking this. Um, there's sort of different senses. You can think of it from a religious uh, covet. Oh, to desire is to okay. You're going back to the religious framing. Okay, to be desirous is to covet. Um, I just wanted okay, and again, I don't have a very clear sense of what desiring is other than the most basic level, but I want to just sort of get us thinking about what this thing could mean and about how it might not be obvious necessarily what desire is when you really think about it. And that's sort of the direction we're headed to today. So for now, keep this discussion at the back of your mind. But let's move on for now. So let's get into the meat of things. So this is where we left off last week. Like this is literally, I think, the last slide. We've been talking about enlightenment reason as if it was this universal monolithic thing. And at the end, we kind of posited the possibility that was that an oversimplification of the Enlightenment? And Antoine Lilty makes this argument, right? That the Enlightenment isn't necessarily about a kind of ideology or about a kind of philosophy, but about just thinking critically. And that this act of critical thinking is linked to ideas of emancipation. And so let's turn back to Descartes, who we sort of visited last week. And last week we read the rules of the direction of the mind, and where he sort of like laid out these very kind of like sort of perfunctory rules about like, okay, this is how you reason correctly. This is how you sort of get to truth. Now we're going to turn to a different text, and this is one of his much more famous works, which is the Discourse on the Method. And again, we've two classes back to back. Our titles have been I think, therefore I am, I doubt, therefore I am. And now today we finally get to it. And Descartes is often most well known for the thinking part of this statement, right? Of sort of like, okay, there's a Cartesian idea of reason, of getting at these universal truths. And that's what the cogito ergo sum, I think that's what it represents. But what's less well known is that there's a flip side to it, and that is doubt is also a pretty central part of Descartes' thinking. There's this full quote in one of his works, I doubt, therefore I am, or what is the same, I think, therefore I am. And so again, we're going back to that earlier quote by Lilty about critical thinking, right? Does doubt have something to do with it? And so let's explore Descartes' text and see exactly what's going on. So this is the opening paragraph of the Discourse on the Method. So he starts by saying that good sense is, of all things, the most equally distributed. And he reinforces that by saying, further down the line, that reason is by nature equal in all men. So it's somewhat egalitarian, right? If you think about it. Reason is this thing that is equally distributed. Everyone has it equally. No one's smarter than one guy's not smarter than another. Everyone's equally rational and smart. But so what distinguishes people's thoughts? It's this. To be possessed of a vigorous mind is not enough. The prime requisite is rightly to apply it. We conduct our thoughts along different ways. So reason, we all have the same capacity to think, but we just all apply it in different ways. And this sort of echoes what we were talking about last week, right? About sort of the Cartesian method of Descartes sort of trying to expound an instrument. And this is the method that he means in Discourse on Method, that we're all equally endowed with reason, but we use it in different ways. Is that a right way of using reason? And so this, again, it echoes what Descartes was saying last week. But again, there's an egalitarian element here that comes into the picture, right? That everyone is equally intelligent. Everyone has the capacity to reason. And then you go through the text, and it's kind of autobiographical. It's like reading someone's personal diary, which is interesting for a text on reason. it's a discourse on method. Here, Descartes is arguing about sort of a logical and rational method of getting to the truth, but it's such an autobiographical text. And turns out this is quite central to what Descartes sort of imagines his method to be. Right here, he talks about like, okay, he this what he thinks about his own reason, about his own brain, and then his experience learning in childhood, and then later on he talks about traveling the world and then like encountering all sorts of people and courts. And so Descartes, again, it's a very autobiographical text. And then, as we'll start to see, this has a lot to do with what he thinks reason is. Let's just read this paragraph a bit more carefully. As soon as my age permitted me to pass from under the control of my instructors, I entirely abandoned the study of letters and resolved no longer to seek any other science than the knowledge of myself or of the great book of the world. I stopped reading books. I stopped focusing on formal education. Instead, I just try to understand myself. Almost sounds like a Tumblr fanfic or like a confessional, but maybe it has similar roots. But essentially, what is Descartes saying here? He's saying that the search for reason, again, last week we talked about Newton, we talked about Bacon, we talked about experiments. We talked about math, and that's sort of our sort of understanding of what reason should be, right? Of knowledge, of sort of an understanding that's quite formalistic, it's quite geometric, it undergoes all of these like very concrete processes. And Descartes is saying, no, I just sat with myself. I'm just processing. And that's quite a strong statement if you think about it. And then what happens as you sit with yourself, as you keep processing? I learned to entertain too decided a belief in regard to nothing. Actually, let me skip that. This point is important. Thus, I gradually extricated myself from many errors powerful enough to darken our natural intelligence and incapacitate us in great measure from listening to reason. So again, what is Descartes doing? He's also he's troubleshooting himself, right? So there's something very skeptical about this. It's not just contemplative, it's not just subjective, but it's also very, very skeptical. It's like, I want to remove myself from all the errors. So again, think about the critical thinking that Lilty was mentioning. Again, this is another side of the Enlightenment that doesn't get emphasized enough. Again, I at length resolved to make myself an object. Same themes like just now. Screw the books. Just look within. That's Descartes. And then that sort of leads us to his method, which we talked about a bit yesterday, but then we'll revisit it now, but sort of with this more contemplative spin that Descartes has put on it. So why is it so important to have a right method? Why is it so important to be contemplative and to look within and to have knowledge of the self? And the bolded line here is quite telling, right? As for the opinions which up to that time I had embraced, I thought that I could not do better than resolve at once to sweep them wholly away, so that you might be in a position that's more correct. And this is an element that we did not talk about that much yesterday. Why develop reason? Why develop critical thinking? Why develop this method? Well, so you have this capacity to sort of like doubt and sort of question all the opinions you've had, right? And this is sort of almost a common feature of a lot of modern debates, or like a lot of framings of like what it means to be a rational bro. Like sort of, I doubt everything. A lot of this you see a lot of the origins here. And again, it's sort of a self-reflexive criticality that we didn't really touch on last week. And then this is sort of Descartes reiterating what we explored last week again. Okay, once you've cleared out all your methods, Descartes is something else. There's a passage where he goes, okay, I am endeavoring to obliterate every single belief I have in my mind. I don't recommend this for everyone, but just so you know, I still have to continue functioning as a normal human being in spite of doing that. So here are 4 rules I've set out for myself to make sure that like I don't go crazy while I destroy my own thoughts. So this guy, he means what he says, I guess. But anyway, here in this case, we talked about this a bit last week too, right? That okay, now you've cleared up all the debris in your mind, all of the errors. You've undergone this skeptical experiment. What next? So you start with the simplest and easiest to know objects, and then you come from like you move up from like simple thoughts to like more and more and more and more complex thoughts until you get to a more fuller picture of the truth. We talked about this last week. And then this is where we actually get to the I think, therefore I am. So Descartes goes, okay, what is the simplest thought that I can get to, the thing that I can think of without any doubt? And so he starts by thinking that, okay, sometimes maybe like there's this sort of thought experiment now that what if we all live in a simulation? Descartes doing something similar. Sometimes our senses deceive us, right? Maybe everything that I'm observing isn't real, right? Everything that I'm seeing are just a bunch of illusions. But then he realized that, wait, even while I was thinking that all of the things I'm looking at are false, I'm already thinking. So therefore, I exist because I think. I think, therefore I am. So that's where the famous quote comes on. You don't have to stress too much about it, but that's just sort of an example of how Descartes is trying to envision this sort of like method of like contemplation, skepticism, and then you reach like sort of this ground truth in Descartes. And then again, that's one part of it. But the other part is once you reach the simple truths, you want to build your way up, right, to more complex versions of truth and knowledge. And so that's what he does. Once he realizes that I think, therefore I am, he also realizes that he can imagine that he has no body, but he cannot imagine not thinking, right? If I had only ceased to think, although all the other objects which I had ever believed had been in reality existent, I would have no reason to believe that I existed. And so I concluded that I was a substance whose whole essence or nature consists only in thinking. And then this is, well, let me just skip forward. The important point here is that he realizes that the mind is distinct from the body, which is, again, we don't have to stress too much. It's not a philosophy class. We don't have to stress too much about sort of the logic in this. But again, it's just an example. I think, therefore I am. I can imagine that I don't have a body, but I can't imagine not thinking. Therefore, the body and thinking must be different. So that's an example of what Descartes means when he moves that up, when he moves through that like chain of reasoning. And again, it's very much influenced by mathematics, geometry, where you sort of like prove things in sequence. What I want you to keep in mind, though, is the I here, right? We talk about desire, and we sort of got at this a bit with like, what does it mean to desire? How might desire feel differently? And I want you to think and sort of just keep in the back of your mind Descartes' sort of subjective experience here. Like he's contemplating, he's thinking, okay, I have no body, I can imagine that. Just think about that, hold it in the back of your mind for a bit. You don't have to do anything about it, just keep it in the back of your mind because we're going to return to this point. And so I think the main thing that comes through, and I hope, I hope this is what comes true from the discussion of Descartes, especially when we compare what we've just been talking about with what we've been talking about last week. We kind of see almost like two different sides of the Enlightenment, right? Like last week, Descartes was like stressing these mathematical and universal laws that are true everywhere. Newton, again, is the great example, right? He posits his laws of motion, the laws of how the planets move in the solar system. And he says this is the mathematics of it, and this is true everywhere. But then here, Descartes is sort of acknowledging a kind of individual subjectivity, right? Yes, there is reason. Yes, there is truth. But the way to get it is through your own individual subjectivity. Everyone should just sit with themselves, think through like their own experiences, and that's how you get to these truths. So it's an interesting double-sidedness. And at the same time, that there is an understanding that there's a proper way of reasoning, there's a proper organon, both in the Baconian and the Cartesian sense. There's also a heavy dose of skepticism, right? Descartes begins his project by literally saying, I'm going to stop believing everything I've ever believed in. And so again, that's interesting because these things seem in tension almost, right? You have universalism on the one hand, but you also have subjectivism on the other. You have rational certitude on the one hand, but you also have skepticism on the other hand. And what I would like to argue, and again, I'm borrowing from Antoine Lilty, um, is that what happens is when you combine these two elements of the Enlightenment, what you get is a very emancipatory narrative. And we'll get to that in another moment. But this other side of the Enlightenment, Descartes, it's already latent in Descartes, but it also appears in other figures of the Enlightenment, like Giambattista Vico and Johann Herder. And Vico himself, what they both have in common is that they criticized the Enlightenment. One of the Enlightenment's tendencies to totalize everything under like these universal and timeless truths. No, things aren't that simple. Things aren't. You can't get to an objective, timeless truth. Nothing is that homogeneous. There's more pluralism in the world. That's kind of what they both were getting at in their own ways. So Vico criticized Descartes, in fact, and Vico argued that well, you talk about these things like reason, but reason is also a human creation, right? It's a historical process. It has to be historicized. Otherwise, you can't really understand it. Herder, for his own part, was sort of arguing against this sort of implication that there's a universal understanding of human nature, that there's a universal mankind, humankind. No, there's not. You have different civilizations, each with their own unique and distinguishing properties. And Herder is sort of one of Europe's founding fathers of nationalism. And this would sort of morph eventually into sort of an understanding of nationalism. So that's where it comes from. And so there's another side of the Enlightenment that's not as simple as like, okay, Newtonian universal laws. And again, once you combine all of these, you get this sort of narrative of emancipation. Because why? Why is education? Why is reasoning? Why is critical thinking? Why is understanding, being able to think and get your way into the truth so important? Because by doing that, that's what sort of liberates you from a kind of dependence. Dependence from what? From superstition, from tyranny, from well, there's some here. I'll just borrow some. From prejudices, from okay, this is tyranny. But you sort of get the idea, and a lot of the social movements of this era, the French Revolution being the biggest one amongst them, sort of drew on this tradition. They saw enlightenment, they saw reason as something that would emancipate people, that would free people, even by like basically unshackling them, by letting them think for themselves, by teaching them how to, sift truth from untruth. And this is a theme and a subtext that we'll keep coming back to. A lot of the things that we'll be talking about in deconstructing, the debates on Islam that Alshia will talk about in several weeks, Marxism, even anti-colonial nationalism, the Indonesian Revolution, they will all draw from this sort of language and tradition of emancipation in their own ways, but this is sort of a very singular tradition, and that's sort of how these two strands come together in the Enlightenment. And to make it more concrete, the best example I can think of sort of this Enlightenment notion of emancipation comes from Mary Wollstonecraft, who's one of the founding figures of Western feminism. And Wollstonecraft herself, for most of her life, until I think like the 20th century, quite recently, she was more well known for her personal relationships. And people didn't really talk about her work, which actually is sort of kind of proves her point, as we'll start to see, that that's the part of her life that people focus on instead of her work. And Wollstonecraft, fun fact, her daughter is Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. And so you can draw a very straight line between Mary Wollstonecraft and Western feminism and Jacob Elordi. That's just me. So Wollstonecraft is very much a prototypical Enlightenment figure. She's steeped in that tradition. She responds and she operates within that tradition, as we'll see. And we'll be looking at a few excerpts from her most famous work, which is A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It's a foundational feminist text in the West. And so let's start. So Wollstonecraft opens her text with a note to Talleyrand, who's this sort of minister in France after the French Revolution. So that's the context. The French Revolution has happened, and the French are trying to draft a new constitution. They're trying to like order a new enlightened revolutionary government, and Wollstonecraft responds to that. And before we get into like what exactly she's responding to, let's take a moment to sort of just read her lines and how she actually tries to think through this, how she's actually arguing about this. She's trying to advance a discussion on the rights of women and national education. Again, very Enlightenment topics, right? National education. And notice how she hedges. Notice how she like portrays herself here. My arguments are dictated by a disinterested spirit. I am being rational. I am making a very rational argument. And she's probably doing two things here, right? One is probably rhetorical. She's trying to preempt sort of this accusation that, oh, you are just a woman of feeling. You are just passionate. You're not rational at all. She's trying to get ahead of that. But some part of it is she is working under the Enlightenment tradition. She's trying to say that, like, I am a rational human being. And as it turns out, that's something that she holds quite dearly as well. She means what she says, and we'll see that more and more with the following paragraphs. She argues that if women are not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge, for truth must be common to all. So again, notice Wollstonecraft's feminism is very much couched in under the broader Enlightenment mission. Women must be educated because, of course, we're all in this mission of Enlightenment emancipation. We want knowledge to keep progressing. We want everyone to we want truth to be known to everyone. We have to educate women for that. Again, this is very Enlightenment coded. And then this again sets the stage for another theme that we'll be exploring, which is that this sort of enlightenment, this sort of education is important because it's going to teach women to be virtuous, and it's linked to these notions of freedom and reason. And again, this is very the specific person I think where she's responding to here is Rousseau, who she criticized, but also she kind of appropriates. And he talks a lot about like we need to be a virtuous society, and here, and that's not a new argument, but again, the Enlightenment flavor of this is that virtue is linked to, again, reason and knowledge, right? To be virtuous is to be rational and to have knowledge. That's what allows you to be virtuous. And then here, Wollstonecraft launches her broadside on Talleyrand and the French revolutionaries. And she says basically that you guys are being hypocrites, right? Because you're saying all of these things about enlightenment, about the uplifting of mankind, of universal reason. Why don't you extend the same rights to women, right? And here she talks, and here specifically she's pointing to the constitution of the French revolutionaries, which excludes women. Who made man the exclusive judge if women partake with him the gift of reason? Women have reason too. You don't have to hog all of this. And again, she uses the French Revolution's language against themselves. In this style, argue tyrants of every denomination, from the weak king to the weak father of a family. They are all eager to crush reason, yet always assert that they usurp its throne only to be useful. You're fighting against tyranny, but you're also acting like a tyrant. You say you want to abolish tyranny, but by putting women down, by denying women their right to reason, you are doing the same thing. You're being hypocritical. And here she basically she in the same line she says the father, the tyrannical father, is the same thing as the tyrannical king. So again, she's drawing a very close line here, and she's using very Enlightenment concepts against people in the Enlightenment themselves. So how does this happen? How do men in Wollstonecraft's argument sort of deny women their use of reason? How do they act as tyrants? Let's read this paragraph in full. The conduct and manners of women, in fact, evidently prove that their minds are not in a healthy state. The education part comes in again. You want to educate them so that presumably their minds move to a healthier state. Why? Because like the flowers that are planted in too rich a soil, strength and usefulness are sacrificed to beauty. And then the flaunting leaves, disregarded on the stalk, they fade before they've arrived at maturity. And so again, this is the language is very striking. And here she gets quite explicit. One cause of this is a false system of education gathered from the books written on this subject by men, who, considering females rather as women than human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than rational wives. And that's really the core of Wollstonecraft's argument. You don't treat females as, user language, human creatures. We're all rational human creatures, but instead of treating females as such, you call them women. You ascribe a very specific, degrading, and like separate set of standards for them. And what are these standards? Standards that have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than rational wives. That makes women anxious only to inspire love when they ought to cherish a nobler ambition and by their abilities and virtues exact respect. So again, it's a very clear argument, right? Women, like, there's this Enlightenment ideal that everyone should be rational and virtuous, and women should get to partake in that too. But here, because you're so obsessed with making them obedient wives, you don't let them do that. And so you sort of degrade them. That's the heart of Wollstonecraft's argument. And then she argues, and this will sound familiar today, with sort of arguments of sort of the male gaze and how you constitute women for men. And Wollstonecraft is making a very similar argument, right? That and here she uses the examples of certain figures like Rousseau and Dr. Gregory of men who sort of, again, the examples are quite telling. This is Rousseau saying, a woman should be governed by fear to exercise her natural cunning and made a coquettish slave in order to render her a more alluring object of desire, a sweeter companion to man. Wollstonecraft is the first person I've read in around this period who like pioneers like full caps words. So, if any of you do that over text, and Wollstonecraft is your predecessor. But anyway, again, it's the same thing we've been talking about, right? Because here you have very clear examples of like men advising women to sort of kind of diminish themselves, right? Sort of like quiet your reason, to sort of be sweeter companions to them. Again, woman is constituted for the man. That's the heart of Wollstonecraft's argument. Another example, he advises them to cultivate a fondness for dress. He actually recommends dissimulation. Dissimulation is like sort of like trickery, and advises an innocent girl to give the lie to her feelings and not dance with spirit. Gentleness, docility, and a spaniel-like affection are on this ground consistently recommended as the cardinal virtues of the sex. She was created to be the toy of man, his rattle, and it must jingle in his ears whenever dismissing reason he chooses to be amused. This is Wollstonecraft at her most eloquent. Woman exists for man's amusement, and that degrades women because, again, you don't get to use your reason. And where does the Enlightenment factor into? Then again, this is a very clear-cut story of Enlightenment emancipation. Men are tyrants. They force women to exist only for men's own sake, and that's why women have to be educated and enlightened to sort of like move away from there. It's whole textbook enlightenment emancipation. Um, and then okay, if if women are in this state, well, how should the relationship between men and women be? And she argues that it should be based on friendship, right? So all this time, women have sort of been taught and constituted to sort of like just amuse men, but maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe you should just be friends, essentially, right? And let women sort of strengthen her body, exercise her will, become virtue, become the friend, and not the humble dependent of her husband. And then, if she's virtuous and she's virtuous and they're both rational and they're both sort of like well intentioned, like you'll be friends and everything. And that's the healthier basis of anything rather than sort of just this sort of tyrannical sort of like hierarchy that we've been talking about. And again, reason comes back again, right? This very enlightenment coded. Let reason teach passion to submit to necessity, or let the dignified pursuit of virtue and knowledge raise the mind above those emotions, which rather embitter than sweeten the cup of life when they are not restrained within due bounds. And here Wollstonecraft is being a bit interesting. She's saying, screw passion, be rational. I don't know what you all think about that, but Wollstonecraft has very specific ideas about virtue and sort of right. It's a very emancipatory story, but there are there are certain traits that Wollstonecraft is sort of like very like harsh on, right? And where she sort of, oh, don't be passionate, be rational, be virtuous, and then that sort of tone comes true again here, right? And again, her language here is very revealing, right? How can the art of pleasing be such a necessary study? It is only useful to a mistress, the chaste wife and serious mother. And so again, it's sort of that there's sort of this framing of, don't be a mistress. To be virtuous is to be a chaste wife, to be a serious mother, right? There's a very specific idea of virtue, and this line here. And the language, again, is very striking, right? And this desire making mere animals of them. When they marry, they act as such children may be expected to act. They dress, they paint, and they nickname God's creatures. Surely these weak beings are only fit for the seraglio. Can they govern a family or take care of the poor babes whom they bring into the world? I don't know, especially women in Zoom on a group chat, on the chat. Like, what do you think? What do you think about what Wollstonecraft is saying here? How do you feel about this? I'm just curious to get your thoughts. Anyone want to weigh in for a bit? Quite relevant. Okay, okay. In what sense? How about the specific part where she talks about how women who are not virtuous and who don't are not properly rational, that they're just animals. They dress, they paint. They're only fit for the harem, for the seraglio, for the brothel. They can't even govern a family. They can't even take care of children. Thank you. That's sort of what I wanted to get at. Thank you, Elsia. um, yes. Thank you, Brenda. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes, something about the way sort of Wollstonecraft argues feels very sort of maybe sort of discontinuous with how we think today, right? And then it begs us to ask the question, what would Wollstonecraft think of women who were forced to give their children up for adoption? What would Wollstonecraft think of sex workers And to go back finally to the poster that we have, what would Wollstonecraft think of the sati? And the sati is there's a practice in India where when the husband dies, the widow must literally like burn herself on the funeral pyre with the husband. And the widow is called the sati widow. What would Wollstonecraft think of the sati? Would she say that the sati is a weak creature, an animal, a coquette, irrational, fit only for the seraglio? Would she, would she, is that something she would say about the sati? And this is where we start to problematize the Enlightenment narrative of emancipation. Because if you've been, again, notice that every even within the Enlightenment, even when you advance a narrative of emancipation, you're sort of glorifying something. I'm emancipating all mankind, all humankind, but also we must all be rational individuals. That's what's going to do it. You sort of enshrine something, even when you're trying to emancipate. And Wollstonecraft is kind of doing something similar. And so this can get problematic. And for this, we'll be turning to Gayatri Spivak. And before we go more into depth there, as a bit of a sneak peek, this is one of Spivak's sort of arguments, right? That in the first world, you have these categories about thinking of sort of social identity and sort of what that means for how bad you have it in life, right? If you're poor, black, and female, you get it in three ways. But if you move this formulation from the first world context into the post-colonial context, the description black or of color loses persuasive significance. Right? Black is, again, this is, well, not just in America, but especially it's something that's sort of salient in the US, given its history of slavery. And this notion of color in a society that's sort of ethnically diverse. But if you move to a different context, these categories might lose their relevance. That's sort of what Spivak is getting at, where you can't just sort of blindly apply these like sort of universal figures and we've seen universal figures already. We've seen the rational individual, and maybe in Wollstonecraft's case, the universal figure is woman. Maybe woman is an Orientalism, to sort of return to last week, right? It homogenizes. Does Wollstonecraft's emancipatory spirit apply to women, maybe not just even outside the West, but maybe even non-middle class women? Wollstonecraft is, again, she's very much writing for a bourgeois audience. And so that's where we turn to Spivak. And she was born and educated in Bengal, and then now she's currently in Colombia. And sort of a lot of the post-colonial thinkers, Spivak, Chakrabarti, Chatterjee, they're all Bengali, and I suspect that they all came of age at a time where like Marxism was sort of like the big thing in Bengal. And so that comes through, I think, in all their thoughts. The sort of the Marxist heritage, they're sort of trying to respond to that and work within that sort of kind of comes true. And Spivak is a major figure in post-colonial theory. Her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, which we'll be talking about today, is really influential in the field. Although Spivak herself has sort of like distanced herself from the post-colonials for all sorts of reasons. But before we get into that, Spivak's quote that we posted on the poster, and it's a banger. So again, just go through it, right? And this is the sati that she was talking about. The Hindu widow ascends the pyre of the dead husband and immolates herself upon it. This is widow sacrifice. The abolition of this right by the British has been generally understood as a case of white men saving brown women from brown men. And again, we might ask, is Wollstonecraft doing the same thing, right? Is Wollstonecraft she's not doing it explicitly, but an uncritical application of Wollstonecraft, especially when we apply her thought to the sati here and think about what she might think of her, could that be a case of white men, or in this case, white women saving brown women from brown men? And you might say, well, let's not just do that. Let's respect the sati's opinion. Let's listen to them. Let's respect her agency. And then you get the other end of the spectrum, which is to say, the women actually wanted to die. And there's something that's a bit and that might not sit right too, again, right? For obvious reasons. They obviously wanted to die. They obviously wanted to burn themselves. Did they? Really? And Spivak cuts through all of that and says that, well, forget about that. Forget about that. Ultimately, what's going on here? One never encounters the testimony of the women's own voice consciousness. You are hearing the white men, you are hearing the white women, you are hearing the nativists saying the women actually wanted to die, but where is the sati herself? Where is her voice? Why don't you hear her? Why can't you hear her say a damn thing? And then you go through all of the reports in the East India Company looking, cataloging all of these sacrificed widows. And again, one cannot put together a voice. Where is the sati's voice? And that's the theme of Spivak and today, and why I've been sort of talking about the I and everything. We're gonna think about what it means to sort of like not have a voice, and how that has to do with like sort of smuggling in an I. And this will become clear hopefully as we go through this. Before I get into Spivak, just a few sort of like primers. So can the subaltern speak? And sometimes people understand the subaltern to mean the oppressed, and Spivak's very clear. When I say subaltern, I don't mean the oppressed. That's not what I mean. In fact, she's going to push back against this notion of the oppressed. And subaltern actually has a very specific history, specifically within Marxism. And again, um, it came about from Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, who was critiquing Lenin's idea of vanguardism. We'll talk about this more when we talk about Marxism. But essentially, the basic idea of vanguardism is that you have the proletariat, and the proletariat is what's going to lead everyone out of capitalist society and into communist society. The proletariat is the agent of revolution. So you understand everything in terms of like, okay, are you proletariat? Are you a bourgeois? Are you blah, 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 blah? And then that's it. Those are the categories you're using to understand the world. And then Gramsci, he's analyzing, especially the peasantry in southern Italy, and he says, wait, they don't fit into any of these categories. And I'm struggling. I'm struggling to talk about them. I'm struggling to understand them because they don't fit into any of the categories that I have. My language cannot describe them perfectly. That is what it means to be subaltern. And to bring this back closer to home, just think about like moments where you wanted to say something and you just couldn't find the words. You're there, but you just don't know how to put it. Or maybe you don't realize something, and then someone tells you something, and then you have like a eureka moment, and it's like, oh wow, that's I never knew it was there, but the way you put it made me realize something. It's this phenomenon of like having, and again, this is why we're going to link back to desire, right? Makes you realize that there's something you thought you never wanted, right? Like maybe you've you've never been to you never wanted to travel, and then someone comes to you and talks to you about their experiences traveling, and they're like, wait, never thought about it, but now I want to do it, right? Just having that language, having that symbolic representation makes something real for you. And subalternity is the state of not having that language to describe your own experience or even to have your own experience described by other people. So that's this notion of like language and speaking, like not being heard. That's key to Spivak's notion of subalternity. And then we also have to talk a bit about the French post-structuralists, who are these people that I've put here. And I've never read any of the French post-structuralists, so it's gonna be a really, really bad primer just based on like some like very brief cobbling together and some LLM help. And essentially, the French post-structuralists kind of like um kind of like Gramsci, we're responding to strains of thought within Marxism, Leninism, right? Where again, you've enshrine the proletariat as this sort of universal subject, as this motor of history, right? Where you're sort of like it's like everywhere you go, you're looking for the proletariat. Is he the proletariat? Are you a proletarian? If you're not, you're like, okay, well, you're sort of like not as useful for me as the proletariat. You're not going to cause any revolutions. And again, the key sort of engine for this in Marxism Leninism is sort of this understanding that there's a structure to history, there's a structure to society, a capitalist, a materialist structure that leads to these categories like capitalist, proletariat. And the French post-structuralists came they sort of like made their move in a time where there was this sort of crisis of faith in the left, where they saw like what happened in the Soviet Union with what happened with Stalinism and the excesses and the horrors of it, and they were trying to sort of like find a way to sort of reconcile their own positions with that. And that's essential. And the French post structuralism is essentially one way to do that, where they try to they sort of argue for this sort of amorphous idea of power and desire, right? Where okay, everyone has their own desires. People, and again, correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't read any of them, but this is just my sense. Everyone desires in their own ways that cannot be sort of like enclosed within sort of these structures of history and society. And then there are different like sites of power that repress this desire in different ways. And really the goal here is to decenter any universal subjects because it's like, well, if everyone's desires are valid, then like we shouldn't sort of we shouldn't glorify the proletariat or any actor really, right? Because everyone's desires are valid and legitimate. And that's sort of what post-structuralism is doing. And Spivak is is gonna critique this. She's gonna say, "You think you're doing this? Are you really? Are you really doing this?" And that's a tricky argument, right? Because again, on surface, what the post-structuralists are doing is I'm emancipating you, right? I'm like I'm emancipating you from Marxist tyranny or like sort of the tyranny of like the proletariat or whatever. Like everyone is valid to is everyone's opinion is valid, everyone's desires are great and all. And Spivak is saying it might not actually be as emancipatory as you think. It sounds counterintuitive, but we'll get into that. Before we get into that, we'll have to we'll spend a few minutes on Spivak's method. And again, if we're talking about again the sati, where's the voice of the sati? And since we're focusing so much on issues of like being unheard and being invisible, Spivak turns to the blank part of the text. Her attention turns to the parts of the text where like you don't really see anything, right? And here's Spivak commenting on there that thought is the blank part of the text, right? That which is thought is if blank still in the text. Okay, wait, I'm going to skip that. That inaccessible blankness circumscribed by an interpretable text is what a post-colonial critic of imperialism would like to see developed within the European enclosure as a place of the production of theory. So what does Spivak mean by the blank part of the text? We kind of got into this in our first session of Module 3, right, where we talked about the difference between economics and Indonesian economics. When you talk about Adam Smith, it's like it's just economics, but you talk about Hatta, you have to say Indonesian economics. There's a blankness there, right? There's a blankness in economics a la Adam Smith, which is sort of doing a lot of work. And so that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on these blank spaces. What is it doing? What is it hiding? And why might it be inaccessible, the way Spivak is talking about? And to hammer this example home, just a very short thought experiment, right? Imagine, like, I'm assuming most of you are Indonesians, or if you're not, just substitute your own nationality. How do you introduce yourself to another Indonesian, right? Either you say where you're from. I'm from Jakarta, gue orang Jakarta. I'm from Bandung. I'm from Surabaya. I'm from Jogja. I'm from Medan, Makassar. Or maybe you'll say, okay, I'm Japanese. I am Minang, or I'm Sudanese, or what have you, right? Um, or maybe even you'll mention your religion. But the moment you talk to a non-Indonesian, you're not going to say any of that. You're just going to say, I'm Indonesian, right? Introduce yourself to an American. You're in a foreign land. What do you say? I'm Indonesian. So there's a blankness there, right? Because clearly when you're introducing to other Indonesians, like you don't have to say that you're Indonesian. Like it's blank because there is like a subtext. And when you talk to other people, when you talk to people from other countries, you you sort of you have to say you're Indonesian because that subtext doesn't exist. And sort of who you are in terms of like which city you're from, which ethnic which ethnic group you come from, that also recedes into a blankness, right? Because it's like they won't get it. So this is what Spivak means by blankness. And she shows how this can be used to like hide things. And here she talks about how Foucault and Deleuze talk about Maoists, right? When they talk about intellectuals, they are named and differentiated. So Jean-François Lyotard, Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari. So if you mention individuals, they get to be particular. They get to be individuals, right? They talk about intellectuals. They get to be named. But here you just say a Maoist. You just say a Maoist, right? Now, what Maoism is something that sort of it came from China, right? But here, what's happening? Foucault is talking about French Maoists. He's talking about a very specific French phenomenon, a French intellectual phenomenon that decided to call itself Maoism. But you don't say that. You don't say French Maoist. You just say Maoist. What does that do? It renders Asia transparent, right? Because, is it all Maoists are Maoists? And that distinction, that difference between a French Maoist and a Maoist from China, that dissolves into the background. Same thing here. Although this is what I meant by like when I was talking about economics versus Indonesian economics, right? Although the history of Europe as subject is narrativized by the law, political economy, and ideology of the West, this concealed subject pretends it has no geopolitical determinations, right? It's like you say economics, you say international law, you say politics, you don't say European, you don't say Western law, Western politics. So that's what the silence is doing in Spivak's sort of understanding. And Spivak is essentially arguing, are the post-structuralists doing the same thing? We've unpacked this last week with what the Enlightenment people were doing with reason, right? You think of it, they talk about it as if it's this abstract thing. Reason is abstract. The person, it's objective, it's universal. It doesn't matter who's saying it, anyone can get to it. What if Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari are doing the same thing with desire and power? Desire is this abstract thing that everyone has. Power is this abstract thing that exists everywhere, and it's separate from the actual people who have them. Right? And that's essentially what Spivak sort of critiques. This definition of desire does not alter the specificity of the desire. Okay, Spivak is very dense, so I think I'm just gonna sort of paraphrase some of her stuff. I'm also running short on time. Essentially, Spivak is arguing that desire is something that is altered when you attach it to different subjects. This is why I started with what do you mean by desire, right? Is desire really the same for everyone? Is it really independent of the subject who desires things? And again, let's think about an example, right? Think about a Parisian tenured professor, which are, again, the French post-structuralists. That's how they've envisioned desire. Do they desire the same way as a Badui? Let's think about how they might not. In Paris, there's this culture of consumerism, right? Of wanting to buy something, of like advertisements and everything. Does that create a different kind of wanting, a different kind of desiring to the non-consumerist society a Badui might live in, right? That might be a difference. In the industrialized West, maybe if you're like again, if you're especially if you're a tenured professor, you probably aren't starving. You don't have to worry about income that much. Not having to worry about starvation, not having to worry about paying rent. Does that make you desire more freely than someone who has to, right? And here's where subalternity comes in, and this is the sort of like how desire can be different that we'll be focusing on from now on. Does knowing the dominant language Does knowing a certain discourse allow you to express your desire more clearly in a way that those who don't can't? What do you mean by this? Like, for example, you are in, again, to go back to Said, you want to get published. A lot of the most prestigious journals are from Western academic institutions. Western academic institutions speak in the language of Western intellectual traditions, Western philosophy. If you're fluent in that, you can express your desire very clearly, right? Because the language is there. But you can express your desire in a way that's legible to other people. That's very like, it's like, okay, it's like, oh yeah, it's here and I can sort of say it. But what if you don't have that, right? Like for example, you've read some Marx, so you have the concept of sort of expropriation, for example. And no, because you've read that, you're like, oh, now I see. This is expropriation. That is expropriation. And I don't want that. But if you don't have that language and you see it, do you see it expropriation, or do you see it as something else? And that's essentially what that's the example Spivak uses here. She talks about Marx. And she talks about how, and she's quoting from Marx here, right? Insofar as millions of families live under economic conditions of existence that separate their mode of life, they form a class. Insofar as this identity of interest fails to produce a feeling of community, they do not form a class. So there is sort of like a definition of class where you're sort of like, okay, because you're all living in a certain way, then you're similar in some sense, you are a class. But the people you're describing in that way might not see themselves as a class if they don't actually feel that community, if they're in a state of subalternity or what have you, right? And here, Marx, specifically in this text, he's asking, how did the peasants end up supporting Louis Bonaparte, the monarchist, instead of the revolutionaries? Even though in Marx's view, their interests are more aligned with the revolutionaries. And his argument is that, and Spivak says that it's because they don't have that concept of class. They don't have that language. They don't have that referential. And so they go for the only concept that they have, that historical tradition can offer, the patronymic itself, the name of the father, which is Napoleon. That's sort of Spivak's argument on a very basic level. And why is she so adamant about this? Why does she direct this critique at the French post-structuralists and how they think about sort of desire and power? And she talks about how people like Foucault, and maybe you'll see this today, there's an unquestioned valorization of the oppressed as subject, right? And again, this sounds emancipatory, right? It's like the oppressed know what they're doing. The masses know perfectly well, clearly. They know far better than the intellectual, and they certainly say it very well, right? And this sounds very emancipatory. I don't want to talk over the masses. I don't want to talk over the oppressed. I don't want to talk over the subaltern. They know better what they want. I don't want to talk over them. How Spivak turns this argument on the head is by saying that, what if by saying that you are already talking over them? What if you're already applying your own understanding of knowing, of desire to them, right? You, Foucault, you, Deleuze, you're a French cosmopolitan intellectual, you're a tenured professor, you've read all of these books, you get to travel wherever you want, you get to talk wherever you want. You have a very specific understanding of what it means to desire and what it means to know. Are you just sort of applying this uncritically to the masses, to the subaltern, who don't necessarily exist in the same conditions as you do? And what does this do? It renders the intellectuals transparent, because now Foucault gets to become bland. He gets to recede into the background. I am not stating an opinion. I'm just being neutral, right? I'm just reporting on like what each different group's desire is. It's the same thing we've been talking about last week, and for a lot of this class too, right? It's this blankness, it's this silence. The intellectual becomes transparent. He recedes into the background. And so what sounds emancipatory actually might not really be. And let's return then to sort of like the women wanted to die and sort of the sati, because in many ways, I think what Spivak is trying to argue is that what the French post-structuralists are doing is very similar to a lot of the romantic nostalgics who glorify the sati widows. They say, and again, some of these quotes are revealing. It sounds like they're respecting the women's agency. It sounds like they're admiring them, right? It sounds like they're taking them very seriously. Look at their cool and unfaltering courage. And here again, the self-pronouncing paternal grandmothers. Are they really? Are they really? It sounds emancipatory. It sounds respectful. It sounds celebratory. Is it really? Is the women wanted to die just a version of the masses know perfectly well? Are they just the same thing? And I'm trying to think about a really good example here is COVID. And I was reading this article about how a lot of healthcare workers were complaining. Why were they complaining? Because all across the news, what was the narrative? What was the narrative? Um, Look at healthcare workers. They're so brave. They're so noble. Look at how much they're sacrificing for us all. That sounds like the masses know perfectly well. That sounds like the women wanted to die. What do the healthcare workers actually think? I don't care about all that. I'm exhausted. Listen to me. I don't care if you think I'm brave. I just want you to put better policies in place so I'm not this exhausted and I don't have to worry about dying and getting sick. It sounds like you're respecting them. It sounds like you're giving them agency. You're not. You're talking over them. That's Spivak's argument. That's Spivak's basic argument. The women wanted to die. The masses know perfectly well. And so to take a step back and sort of summarize everything somewhat, um, what is this hidden eye, right? Because that's the way the way you get things like this is by sort of like rendering the eye transparent, right? You think you're not talking, you assume you're not speaking for someone, but really you are. And that's where emancipation gets very slippery, right? Because you say, I'm not speaking for them, I'm freeing them. Are you? Are you really? It's tricky. It's very, very tricky. And we can see how, in each example, how this is being done. Descartes, who is the I that becomes invisible in Descartes? Descartes himself, right? Again, he's a cosmopolitan intellectual. He gets to go to academies. He gets to travel around. He doesn't have to worry about, like, I don't know, whether his crops are gonna yield an adequate harvest. He gets to like sit underneath an oven for like months and be like, oh, discoursive method, which is fine, nothing wrong with that. But that subject experience, that experience of Descartes as the subject, sort of disappears. Same thing with Wollstonecraft's critique of the Enlightenment. Here it's men. Men are enshrined as the subject. Men become invisible. The I in the Enlightenment is the rational man. But the man part disappears into the background, and Wollstonecraft is calling that out. Wollstonecraft is doing the same thing because who becomes the I who disappears in Wollstonecraft? It's the Enlightenment European. It's the enlightened European. And then the French post-structuralists are doing the same thing because this time it's them themselves. It's actually quite similar to what Descartes is doing, right? Their own experiences, like cosmopolitan French intellectuals living in a very specific industrialized capitalist Western society and sort of like projecting their sort of notions of desiring and power to everyone. And so let me end this with one of the final examples that Spivak closes her text with. And she asks, finally, can the subaltern speak? And then she gives an example of Bhuvaneswari Baduri, who is, again, she hanged herself. She was a young woman who hanged herself in North Calcutta, 1926. This was before independence. And she was menstruating at the time of the suicide. And then Spivak sort of reveals that it was discovered that Baduri was part of a lot of independence groups. And she she botched a political assassination, so she couldn't do it. But then she realized that she she realized essentially that well, I failed at my task and now I'm a liability. So I have to remove myself from the equation. The practical need for trust, right? She's a liability. She can be if they kidnap her and then they're like, why did you do this? We're co-conspirators. And so she opts out basically by killing herself and to protect these groups in arms, or at least that's what I got out of this story. But Bhuvaneswari had another thought in mind, knowing sort of, and I presume this is just sort of the context of Indian society at the time. She was aware of the risk that people would look at her suicide and say she was she was she was pregnant with an illegitimate child. That's why she killed herself. She was pregnant with an illegitimate child, and she didn't want people to think that. And that's why she killed herself when she was menstruating. To um, sort of like make it clear that I'm not pregnant. That's not why I did it. That's not what I did it. And how this matters for us is that for Spivak, the Baduri suicide is a subaltern rewriting of the social text of Stati suicide. Baduri is trying to say something, right? She's trying to say something. She's trying to say, I'm killing myself out of my own agency, not because of some man or some child or some act of passion. I'm killing myself for political reasons. But she has no way to say it. She has no way to say it. And so she does it in the only way she knows how, which is to kill herself when she was menstruating. This is, and Spivak uses this as an example of what happens when a subaltern who cannot speak tries to speak. You try to like reach for the tools you have on hand. And ultimately, Spivak's conclusion is quite pessimistic because she concludes that in spite of all this, the subaltern cannot speak. Spivak goes through. Baduri does all of this, and then she does it, and Spivak goes deeper and tries to investigate. What do people think of it? What do people think? Why did people think Baduri do? Why do people think Baduri did what she did? And the answers are quite revealing. Melancholia, brought on by her brother-in-law's revealed taunts that she was too old to be not yet a wife. And then she asked relatives of Baduri, and these were their responses. Why are you so focused on her? She's helpless. Focus on her two sisters with full and wonderful lives. And again, once you ask her nieces, it appears that it was a case of illicit love. Baduri killed herself while she was menstruating with the explicit desire to not be pegged as this, and yet it happens to her anyway. The subaltern tries to speak, the subaltern cannot speak. And so, final slide for today. Just to step back a bit and try to link it with the upcoming class. And this is from Spivak's interview at a writers' conference. So we've been talking about the subaltern very at length and how the subaltern sort of, you can't be heard, can't speak. What does this have to do with the post-colonial state? What does this have to do with post-colonial society? And Spivak has her own diagnosis of what she thinks is the limitation of anti-colonial nationalism, of decolonization as it happened in the 1900s. And her words are very telling. The nationalist narrative of decolonization is like a vaccine that did not take with the subaltern, precisely because the subaltern had no access to the culture of imperialism. Who led the nationalist movement? Post-colonial elites who had access to this culture, who did not, the subaltern. And therefore, today in decolonized areas, the fact is that all of those alibis for decolonization are absolutely useless. The people have no particular vested interest or feeling of identification with those great alibis used just less than 50 years ago. Decolonization, anti-colonial nationalism did not speak to the subaltern, did not listen to the subaltern. And that's why a lot of the problems you see today. That's Spivak's diagnosis. And that's a perfect segue to our next class, where we'll be talking about, again, these past 2 weeks, we've been talking about notions of rationality and reason and the subject and emancipation. We'll get slightly less philosophical in the next session, where we talk about the state, specifically the nation state. What does it mean to define a nation? What is a state? What is the relationship of the state with the nation? And what does this have to do with the problem that Spivak raised here? What happens when the nation state does not listen to the subaltern? We'll be reading Thomas Hobbes, The Leviathan, and also Partha Chatterjee, who's another thinker from the post-colonial tradition. The next few weeks are going to be super packed. A lot of graduation, a lot of convocation and commencement ceremonies around here. So we'll probably take a hiatus next week and the week after. So when we meet again, it's going to be around June, I think. But I will keep you posted. We'll let you all know in the chat. But other than that, yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry for going over time. I kind of rambled a bit with this one. But yeah, it's a very long session. But if anyone wants to ask questions and have discussions, I'm going to open the floor.
I actually question
Yeah, go ahead.
but I already put a question in the chat box. It's just if I may read it out, the question:
Sure.
Does identity also part of abstract realism? I don't know how to pronounce that. Realm that post-structuralists try to explore or discuss. I will try to put it on the end.
Yes, I think I see what you mean. I think I found your question. It's this small.
Yeah, because most of the context, the discussion, also questioning about the cultures, the society, and identity about self. So that's just the thought that appears in my head while. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I can't answer this as fully as I want to because I haven't actually read the post-structuralist. But what I can comment on is people after the post-structuralists who try to link identity with the post-structuralists. So there are arguments that basically go along the lines of a lot of contemporary notions of identity and identity politics, particularly, come from the post-structuralists. Again, I don't know how much of this is a legitimate diagnosis, how much of this is a caricature, but essentially the argument goes that like, okay, by enshrining sort of this homogenous desire, and like by saying like, okay, everyone desires differently, and then sort of like, everyone has their own desires from their own positionalities in life. That sort of like paved the way to sort of like people sort of like to this sort of definition of identity that's built around this, right? That's like, okay, different groups, different identity groups have different desires, and then based on these desires, you get different kinds of identity groups. And so there is that connection that some people do draw, especially I think on the more Marxist and materialist corners of the left. It's usually in a more critical direction. They don't like this at all. But that's the most that I know about this. Bye, Nata. And did that answer your question, Jeff?
Yeah, it does. It actually appears to another thought, but I'm afraid it's gonna cost like 1 or 2 hour session, so I'm just gonna cut it out here. Thank you so much, right?
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you for the question. Anyone else want to? Okay, let me try to read. There's a lack of intersectionality. I'm wondering how Hindu community. I'm actually not sure about this, so I can't really answer. I can't actually answer this. Yes, sorry. It's very heavy today. Spivak is one of the densest writers I've encountered. It's like my pace of reading Spivak is like 2 pages a day, which is horrific. But so thank you for sticking in with us. I've tried my best to sort of make it less unwieldy, but But yeah. Okay, I think like it's gone for long enough, and I think Speedbox fried everyone's brains, so I think I'll let you all go. Thank you so much. I will see you in our next session. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye bye. Have a good day.
Thank you so much, Derek.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone.